Welcome into another episode of Home Field Advantage. Hope you're all having a great week or weekend, however you may be listening or watching across our great country or our great land. Today is May 27th, 2024. My name is Will Highland, and it is a special episode of Home Field Advantage. I again thank you all for joining us today and listening to the program. There's a lot of different directions we can go today. The Boston Celtics tonight tip off with a chance to clinch the series and move on to the NBA Finals. I'm sure by the time you're listening to this, you know the outcome of that result. College baseball is getting ready for the College World Series. Bill Walton passed away at age 71. He died of cancer. There are a number of stories around the sports world, including what's going on in the NHL playoffs, what's going on in the NBA playoffs. I'm already mentioned the Celtics, but the Mavericks are on the verge of moving on as well. And we also have some really sad stories like in golf. Graham Murray, I believe is his name. Actually, I don't want to mess up that name, but he was 30 years old and he was found dead. And so there's a lot of sad stories in the world of sports between him and Bill Walton and other things. But there's also some good stories. He's talking about the teams that I just mentioned with a chance to move on. But where I want to spend today's episode, though, because it is Memorial Day, I want to step outside the realm of sports for a moment, and take a few minutes to describe the a few heroes of mine who transcend the heroes that might be on the wall behind me if you're watching on YouTube. It's not Tom Brady, it's not Tim Thomas, it's not Dennis Eckersley, it's not an athlete. The in my opinion, the real heroes are the ones that wear the uniform and our first responders or veterans. But today in particular is really about veterans who paid the ultimate sacrifice so that we can have a 3-day weekend. You know what I mean? And I don't want that to get lost. So many times Memorial Day now, people abbreviate it MDW, all right, kickoff to summer, all that stuff. And I get it, I do it too. There's nothing wrong with it. But the reason why we don't want to simplify it to just that is because there are so many families across this country, millions of them, that today is a day of solemnness, right? Like it's not just another holiday, and oftentimes it gets mixed in with Veterans Day, but today is really about those who didn't make it back home. And our country is full of extraordinary heroes who paid this sacrifice for our country. And that's why I'm wearing the American flag on my hat today. And that's why I want to take just a few minutes to talk about three of them in particular who stand out in my memory that I wrote down. From a sports context, though, you can look back at people like Pat Tillman, who gave up an NFL career to go serve our country, and he was killed in 2004 in Iraq, or excuse me, I believe it was Afghanistan. I want to fact check myself on that real quick. But Pat Tillman, certainly one of the yeah, he died in Afghanistan. Certainly one of the first that comes to mind from a sports context. But elsewhere, I also want to look back at a couple that have made their mark not only in their extraordinary service to this country, but also in modern pop culture in terms of you can see some of their stories play out on the big screen. And a lot of times when it comes to these movies, they're incredible films like Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers or The Pacific or 13 Hours or American Sniper or any of these ones that I just reeled off. Incredible, incredible. stories, but that doesn't necessarily tell the whole picture. I mean, they're people, right? So with the caution of rambling too much, I'll get into it here with just three particular veterans and fallen heroes that I wanted to talk about. The first is way back in the Civil War, and if you've seen the 1989 film starring Matthew Broderick, you've probably seen or know this story. But Robert Gould Shaw was a uh, white lieutenant colonel, I believe was his rank. Um, I want to double check that. I believe he was a lieutenant colonel. Um, Maybe he was just a colonel. Either way, he was in the American Civil War. Um, from the 54th Massachusetts. He was in command of that unit. And the notable thing about the 54th Massachusetts is that it was an all-black regiment during the Civil War, fighting for the Union. And Robert Gould Shaw was an abolitionist, a white guy who took control of this unit, and there were even a lot of people in New England in the Northeast that were raising their eyebrow at Robert Gould Shaw. And he's portrayed in that film called Glory that also stars Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman. He's in that film, and Matthew Broderick plays the role of Robert Gould Shaw, where his service tragically ended was at the Battle of Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina. And Charleston, South Carolina, during the time of the Civil War, was a key point in commerce for the Confederacy. So uh, they needed that port, and it was heavily defended because from an economic perspective, the Confederacy needed that port in order to still conduct its trade. But they were sent down there, the 54th Regiment and Colonel Shaw, and were placed under the command of a man named General Quincy Adams Gilmore to take part in a second attempt at Charleston. They had tried earlier in what's called the First Battle of Fort Wagner and failed. And I'm reading straight from Wikipedia here, so this isn't from memory, okay? But quote, to do so, they would have to capture Fort Wagner, which defended the southern approach to the harbor. A significant Confederate garrison had been stationed there, and the fort was well armed with an assortment of heavy guns. The overall strength of the defenders was underestimated by Union command. The Union effort was supported by two other brigades, but the approach was narrow and only one regiment could attack at a time. Think about that, right? It's this old, very old way of doing war prior to World War I. At the battle on July 18th, 1863. Now, for context here, this is less than 2 weeks after the Union victory at Gettysburg. So the Union had a lot of momentum coming out of Gettysburg from a military strategy perspective. But this is just how quickly after Gettysburg. I don't think the 54th Massachusetts was involved at Gettysburg, to my knowledge. They were more in the Southern theater, not really in the Virginia, Pennsylvania theater of the war. But either way, on that day, they approached the fort in the late afternoon and then waited out of range for a night assault. So their plan was to take Fort Wagner at night. After a heavy bombardment from the sea, the 54th charged forward to take on the batteries. Colonel Shaw led his men into battle, shouting, "Forward, 54th, forward." The 54th crossed the moat and scaled the muddy hill of the outer wall. With the cessation of the naval bombardment, the largely intact Confederate garrison left their bomb proofs and resumed their positions on the walls. In the face of heavy fire, the 54th hesitated. Shaw then mounted I don't know how to pronounce this word, but uh, it's pronounced or it's spelled parapet. Parapet. Essentially, it's a wall of a fort, and urged his men forward, but was shot through the chest 3 times. By witness testimony of the unit, His death occurred in the early battle, and he fell on the outside of the fort. Some other reports from the Confederates say that his body was hit as many as 7 times. The fighting continued until 10 p.m. when the Union forces withdrew, having suffered heavy losses. Among the fatalities were Shaw, General George Crockett Song, Colonel Hadlamond S. Putnam, and Colonel John Chatfield. But it was Shaw's 54th Regiment that suffered the heaviest losses. So you might be thinking, why are we celebrating his service? They lost, and to me that's like, this is in a sports context, right? Like win or lose, like the Union won the war. And just because Shaw's attempt at overtaking Fort Wagner failed that time with his regiment taking charge, it was his bravery and his willingness to try that led to his tragic death, and it's not always that you get the job done. It's that you are willing to try, because at some point in history, every great victory was usually preceded by a tragic heavy loss, and that's what this was for the Union. Eventually, the Union was able to take control of Charleston, of course, and therefore the rest of the Southeast in succession, and ultimately force the surrender a couple of years later. But it was Shaw's willingness to take on this unit. It was Shaw's willingness to enlist himself in incredible bravery that led to the end of his service in tragic death. But he is immortalized. If you go to the Boston Common, there is a memorial to the 54th Massachusetts on, I believe, the northeastern corner of Boston Common, which is an incredible piece of memorial if you've never seen it before. And with around New England, he has uh, very numerous tributes to his service. So, in my opinion, he's one of my heroes of the Civil War, um, who did not make it back home. Now, another one who has been um, instilled into pop culture in recent years is a man by the name of Lieutenant Curtis Rundle Bittick. He was actually part of the 100th Bomber Group during World War II, a member of the 8th Air Force. And his story was popularized in Masters of the Air, which just came out a few months ago on Apple TV. And he's, I believe, portrayed by Barry Keoghan, who's an Irish actor. And Barry Keoghan was also in Dunkirk as an actor, so he has some history playing war heroes. But Curtis Bittick's story begins in Livingston, Wisconsin. He was born in 1915, the son of Ernest and Delphus Bittick. He was in college at UC Davis from 1932 to 1937 during the end of the Great Depression. He was basically working in a wholesale meat packing plant in San Francisco when Pearl Harbor happened. And like thousands, if not millions of Americans, that was a rallying cry for him to join the service. So in January 1942, he enlisted as an aviation cadet in the Army Air Corps. At the time, there was no Air Force. So Bittick, like hundreds of others, including those uh, popularized and played by Austin Butler and Callum Turner in Masters of the Air, were also a part of the Army Air Corps because the Air Force hadn't yet existed. He graduated as a pilot that year and was assigned to the 100th Bomb Group in the spring of 1943. Now, the 100th Bomb Group had their home base in England at a place called Thorpe Abbotts, and they routinely took missions into German territory to bomb things such as ball bearing plants, U-boat factories, other industrial targets. But the United States Air Corps during World War II did not take part in evening shelling and bombing because they wanted precision over deliverance. They were very cognizant relative to the time of not hitting civilian air targets, ground targets. So during World War II, especially during the early years of World War II, from an American perspective, people like Biddick taken were taking charge of airplanes in broad daylight, and they were extremely vulnerable to flak, which is ground artillery used to take down aircraft. And so there was one raid that the 100th Bomber Group was a part of called the Regensburg mission. And Regensburg was a city, a very industrial city that had to be targeted because I believe it was a ball bearing a plant. And his bomber group, the 100th Bomber Group, and his specific airplane, the 42-5860 Escape Kit was the name of his plane. They were assigned to what's called Coffin Corner, which was like the back part of the formation, because a lot of these airplanes flew in like a triangular formation with one another. That way, they were harder to take out. But if you were in the back, you were very vulnerable because you could be picked off if you fell out of formation. So on August 17th, 1943, his plane was about 40 miles north of Regensburg from the target site, but they had an oxygen fire that caused a lot of damage to the nose of the aircraft and the fuselage, and it trapped those airmen in the flight deck. Tragically, 4 of the crew members, including Lieutenant Biddick, were killed in action in that fire. And he was not alone. The 100th Bomber Group was routinely nicknamed the Bloody 100th because of how many incredible losses, and not incredible in a good way, but just the volume of losses that air group experienced during World War II was unbelievable. There was one raid, I believe it might have been this raid. I don't want to get my history wrong, but only one plane made it back, and that was the plane piloted by, I should say, a bomber. One bomber piloted by Rosie Rosenthal. Robert Rosenthal was his real name, but he was often called Rosie. I believe there was one where 13 aircraft were sent and only one made it back, and it was Rosenthal's. This was a part of the war that is extremely undersold, meaning it's not talked about a lot. It's not talked about in the same way that the amphibious invasion of Normandy was, or that the Pacific Theater was from an American perspective. Not to say that those weren't important, of course they were, but with the air superiority being a key factor in laying the groundwork for there to be an invasion on D-Day, it is men like Lieutenant Biddick whose units had to undertake that extremely difficult mission of obtaining air superiority, over the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force. The amount of missions that they had to do in a very short amount of time, with not a lot of lead time to them, was incredibly difficult, and a lot of them were shot down and basically taken as prisoners of war in interior Germany for the remainder of the conflict. That's popularized in Masters of the Air as well. Gail Clevin and oh gosh, what's his name? Gail Clevin and the other one there, John Egan, excuse me. They were taken into a German prisoner of war camp and not treated very well. And it wasn't until the end of the war that they were either escaped or liberated. Um, so Biddick is among hundreds of other airmen who died just from the 100th Bomber Group. I think I was looking through, and there were dozens, if not hundreds, of individual casualties, not to mention those who were missing in action or prisoners of war. So when you look back at World War II, the contributions of the 8th Air Force cannot be understated. All right, and the third and final one I want to talk about, I would consider to still be a military death of some kind. In our lifetime, one of the one of the things I'm most thankful for is that the there are still dozens, if not hundreds, of people that that are that are alive from that you can talk to from Vietnam, Korea, but those from World War II, like that generation I was just talking about, they're starting to pass away quickly. And a lot of times we look back and we say, when we talk about veterans, we talk about the wars prior to 2000 and prior to Iraq and Afghanistan in a little bit of more of a idealist, idealistic manner, meaning like it, it's more historical. But in reality, there have been wars in our lifetime, in my lifetime, in a lot of your lifetime, if you're listening and you're under the age of 30, that don't get the same amount of recognition from a historical perspective, where where people or people were killed just like in those other wars. Um, and similarly, there have been veterans who of those wars who, after it was over, took up arms in a different way. And this last gentleman I'm going to talk about, his name's Tyrone Woods. He was born on January 15th, 1971, in Imperial Beach, California, or excuse me, in Portland, Oregon, and he grew up in Imperial Beach, California, and he graduated from Oregon City High School in 1989. So he's a pretty young guy. I mean, he's only, if he was alive today, he'd only be in his early 50s. Um, he served 21 years in the U.S. Navy, which is incredible. And after his service in the Navy, where he was a SEAL, he joined the State Department Diplomatic Security Service. A lot of times that tends to happen to veterans who get out of get out of the service and they take their service and their bravery to other parts of our security apparatus in the United States. And he was assigned to work in the Middle East, but um, he had been guarding diplomats all over the world, Central America, the Middle East. Um, but in 2012, he was a uh, he was a member of the security team in Benghazi, Libya. And this is after, in 2005 and 2006, while he was still in the Navy, he had a Combat V for Valor in Iraq, and he was a Bronze Star Medal winner in Iraq after leading 12 direct action raids and 10 reconnaissance missions um, in the Al Anbar province, which was the most volatile and dangerous part of Iraq during the Iraq War. So he had spent a lot of time in the Middle East while he was a Navy SEAL. Then he retired in 2010, as I said, as a senior chief petty officer. Um, but but it was his service in Benghazi, Libya, where, while not serving under the purposes of the armed um, the armed forces, he was serving the United States. From a security perspective, and in my opinion, he deserves to be memorialized today, despite that difference in classification. But as many of you may know, in 2012, there was a incredibly volatile situation in Benghazi, Libya. It was actually on September 11th, 2012. So it was on the 11-year anniversary of 9/11, and the United States Embassy in Benghazi was attacked by uh, militants that eventually, sort of morphed to become ISIS. This group of this, or not this movement, but this movement of militantism in the Middle East grew to become part of ISIS, and the the movie 13 Hours stars John Krasinski, and it tells the story of people like Tyrone Woods. Um, but essentially, the CIA and the State Department Security Services kind of had to just fend for themselves at the embassy while it was being overrun, because they were not well equipped and defended against this attack by these rebels and militants in Libya. And the embassy was stormed early in the morning of September 12th. And I'm going to read straight from the Wikipedia account just to make sure I get all the details correct. Uh, it says that night, a group of militants from Ansar al-Sharia assaulted the compound. The guards were quickly overrun, which allowed the attackers easy access to the compound. There was Ambassador Chris Stevens and Sean Smith, who was an IT specialist. They were taken to the safe room, but they were unable to breach it. The attackers set the building on fire, and they were trying to burn those guys out. Several were able to escape, but Stevens and Smith were lost. So we lost an ambassador and another State Department employee in that raid. At the annex, the GRS team, which was the security, basically the security team, there was some off the books things happening, of course, with the CIA there too. They needed help, but the team was unable to get help fast enough, and knowing that the attacks by the militants were imminent, the CIA staff, the security service people at the annex tried to make desperate calls for help. But it was former U.S. Navy SEAL Glenn Doherty, who was a GRS operator in Tripoli. He was there. He formed a team. But I'll get to the point here with Tyrone Woods. Essentially, the militants started launching a mortar attack on the compound and on the annex. And there was a man named Mark Geist who was nicknamed Oz, and he was wounded, and his arm was in really bad shape. But it was Tyrone Woods who rushed to aid Geist and was tragically killed by another mortar round. Doherty was also killed when a third mortar detonated near him. So not only did we lose Tyrone Woods, but we also lost a former U.S. Navy SEAL, Glenn Doherty. And I was wrong. Woods was not a Navy SEAL. As I mentioned, he retired a chief petty officer. It was Glenn Doherty who was, and he was killed there too. And at the end, there were a lot of people who made that who were able to make that situation less bad than it was. But it was Jack Silva, who was played by John Krasinski. It played a huge role. There was a man named John Teagan, nicknamed Tig, who was a former Marine. There was Tonto Peranto, who was a former U.S. Army Ranger. But it was Doherty and Woods who were lost there. Oh, okay, I wasn't wrong. Woods was a former Navy SEAL. I thought he was. That seems too strange to me that he wasn't. But anyway, I know that was a little bit of a choppy account. But what all of these three guys had in common, not only was their extraordinary service to the country, but also their willingness to go forward in a mission that didn't have a good outcome, right? Like it wasn't like they were heavily favored in any of these situations. Lieutenant Biddick was flying into Nazi territory at the end of a formation with little backup and little help, and in a very volatile environment high up in the early history of airplanes. Um, Lieutenant Shaw was, or excuse me, Colonel Shaw was in the midst of a very heavily um, fortified area of Charleston, trying to take it over for the second time, knowing that his odds were low. He tried anyway. And lastly, it was Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty, who, former SEALs who had seen hard action before in places like Al Anbar, brought in to try and save the annex and the compound and the embassy in Benghazi, with little to no help from anybody else. And it was these guys, had all of whom had incredible obstacles to overcome, but tried anyway. And even though their service ended in tragic death, their bravery and willingness to try amidst the obstacles is found across millions of American servicemen, past, present, and future. There are gardens, there are cemeteries, there are memorials in towns all across our country filled with stories just like these three guys. There are stories of people who don't make it into three films like the ones I just described, but rather who are etched in small town cemeteries in places you've never been and will never go. And they might not be buried in places like Arlington or Normandy, but their service is not, uh, in my opinion, and of course I never wore the uniform, but I think a lot of veterans would agree with me, their service is not any different from anyone else's. Um, in in our country, we are blessed with so many things that other people would love to have. And this the reason why this holiday is important to me is because if these men were willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice so that I could sit here and bloviate to you on a random Wednesday night in a few days about the NHL, or that I could wake up one day and be safe in my own country because of their sacrifice, if that's what they were willing to do, then the least I can do is take 30 minutes of my time to try and tell their story, and further the knowledge of their service. Um, there's a story that I heard, and for political reasons, I'm not going to tell you who came up with it because I don't want that to cloud the story. Um, but I've flown out of Ronald Reagan Airport before, which is in Washington, D.C. It's on the south side of D.C. and the Potomac River. And I think it's technically in Virginia. And when you fly out of DC, it's an incredible sight. On one side of the plane, you can look out, as my wife and I did a few years ago when we flew out of there, and you can see the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Memorial, the Washington Monument. You can see the White House. If you're lucky and you get a good angle, you can see the Capitol building and the entire mall. It's an incredible situation if you ever get the chance to fly at Reagan Airport. And so for many people, um, those are the most important tributes to the United States. The seat of our government, the home of our president, the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument and the reflecting pool, all incredible symbols of our country. But on the other side of the plane, if you were sitting, you look out and you see the Arlington National Cemetery, where the tomb of the unknown soldier is located, where there's an ever-present Marine Guard there, where thousands of graves lie for those just like these three guys who sacrificed their life for our country. And I would argue, as this guy did who told the story, that the situation on the other side of the plane that you can see, all those graves at Arlington National Cemetery, that's the real most important tribute to our country, is what those men were willing to do. Because the fact that those men and women were willing to die for what's on the other side of the plane shows you that there's still something out there in this country. A lot of times I talk about national malaise, I talk about shared culture, I talk about all these sort of abstract things, and perhaps this is abstract too, but I think if there are people like them who are willing to die for our country, then the least I can do is talk about it for a few minutes. So on this Memorial Day, I know we didn't talk about sports today. We talked about something a little bit more important, but for me, it it's something it's something that's significant and needs to be shared, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to do so. So on this day, we remember their service, we remember their bravery, we remember their sacrifices, and for that, I'm incredibly grateful to be an American and share the American experience with them. But they obviously took it one step further and paid it all so that we didn't have to. And that's a very it's a very much an American ideal. It's also a Christian ideal. John 15:13 says, there's no greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. So I'm proud, I'm proud to be an American. Um, and I'm extremely grateful for their sacrifice. And I hope you all enjoyed the little tribute that I can give here. We'll be back later in the week to talk some more sports with you. As I said at the outset, we got a lot of things going on, and I'm looking forward to the future of of what we have with the NHL and NBA playoffs, MLB, all kinds of stuff. The NFL schedule was released, so maybe I could talk Kyle into doing some predictions on our next pod, um, even though it's not hockey related. But until then, have a great rest of your week. Have a great rest of your weekend. Remember why we have this day. And please let me know what you think. If you have any suggestions, any stories of heroes that I may have missed, send me a DM. I can be found at Homefield Pod on Instagram. But until next time, my name is Will Highland, and you have been listening and watching Homefield Advantage.